Okay, I'm live right now. So do dogs have consciousness? I've been reading up a little bit about this and I'm not a scientist, but I do definitely have thoughts on this. Um, Going back to some of the research I read about is one called the mirror test. Now, in the mirror test, for example, what they'll do is they'll take some animals and put them in front of a mirror with usually a red dot that's on their forehead. And they usually do this with like chimpanzees or apes, these type of primates and other animals. And the animals will recognize themselves in the mirror and see the red dot in the reflection, and they'll try to take off the red dot because they see something that doesn't belong on their face. So they recognize their face and they recognize there's something that shouldn't be on their face. And so in that sense, they're recognizing that they're a unique individual, that they are, that they're not seeing another animal of the same type on in the mirror. They're recognizing themselves. So self-awareness is part of the consciousness mirror test. Now, dogs don't pass this test, unfortunately. And I have a couple ideas that may be flaws of this test for a dog. What dogs do pass, however, is the urine test. And what they'll do is they'll collect a urine sample from a specific dog and collect urine samples from other dogs. And they'll place those urine samples randomly in a field. And they'll time how long it takes each dog to sniff the different urine samples in the field. And what they find time and time again is that a dog will spend much less time sniffing its own urine than it will sniffing the urine from other dogs. So that dog is identifying that that urine is his, and therefore is less interested in its own urine but more interested in the urine of other dogs. So there's a little bit of debate whether this concept of mine can be associated with self or self-awareness. Hey, how are you doing? So the flaw I see with the mirror test is that I see two flaws particularly. One is that we as humans have a lot of our brains associated with our visual experience. We have a visual self-concept. So we have a very good idea of what we look like. I don't have to see my reflection or a picture of myself to know that I'm a white guy with green eyes, dirty blonde hair, with stubble on my face. And I have a fairly good idea of how my face is shaped and my crooked ear and these sort of things. So when I see myself in the mirror, it's like that matches my self-concept, my visual self-concept of what I should look like. Now, if I were to look into a mirror and see a black guy looking back at me, I'd be very confused as to whether that's me or somebody else, because that wouldn't match my visual self-concept of what I should look like. And dogs, because their brains, they don't have a lot of brain matter that associates with their visual experience, may not have a very good concept of what they should look like. They may not have a very good visual self-concept. So when a dog sees itself in the mirror, it may not know that the image it's seeing matches its own visual self-concept. It is 12:55 p.m. So, but dogs do have very large amounts of brain matter that is associated with smell. And this is why they do extremely well with the urine test. Now, we as humans, because we are so visual and our visual experience has such a high correlation to our concept of self, we almost take it for granted that how could you look at something and not recognize it? How can you not look at yourself and not recognize yourself? But the thing is, for a dog to recognize its own urine, for example, and recognize that a urine sample doesn't belong to them, well, I would fail that test. Now, because I don't have a very good smell self-concept of myself. I don't have a very good self-concept of what I smell like. So if someone took a urine sample from me and random urine samples from other individuals, I wouldn't be able to pass the test of which urine belonged to me. Or if sweat was collected from me and sweat was collected from other individuals, I wouldn't be able to determine which sweat belonged to me, because I don't have, my brain is just not structured in such a way or wired in such a way to understand what Darryl Learie smells like, as opposed to what other people smell like. But interestingly enough, when they do this mirror test with dogs, a lot of dogs do urinate around the mirror. So they might be thinking that's them, and therefore they're going to urinate around the image of what they've seen of themselves. It's just an interesting thing to bring up because it happens a lot with the mirror test. They'll urinate around the mirror that's reflecting their own image. Now, another thing that does come to mind, aside from associating this idea of recognizing yourself in a mirror as part of a test for consciousness, this awareness of your own self, is I think selfishness is something that's associated with consciousness. Now let me explain. If an animal or an insect, for example, an insect is a very good example because they're just primarily reactive. They just react to environmental influences and stimuli. If they received a set of instructions, for example, their brains would process those instructions and simply carry them out, whether or not those instructions meet their interests. Of course, when we're talking about insects, we'd be talking about very simple instructions, like instructions on how to navigate a maze or something to get to the food or something like that, something very easily comprehensible. But when you have consciousness, you also have a strong sense of selfishness, of wanting something for yourself versus wanting something for others, of wanting your needs met versus the needs of others. And dogs definitely have the potential to display selfishness. And to me, because a dog can decide whether it wants to pursue something or it does not want to pursue something. It has a sense of, I like this or I don't like this. And to like something or not like something is a preference, and I think that has a strong correlation with consciousness, because if they didn't have consciousness, a dog would simply carry out whatever instructions were fed into its brain. Its brain would just process those instructions and it would just carry out those instructions with no preference whatsoever, because it wouldn't make a difference to that dog, because there would be no consciousness, there would be no preference, there would be no favoritism. And I think animals that do illustrate selfishness, like two dogs fighting over a bowl of food, for example, illustrates some degree of consciousness. So this is basically my thoughts on whether or not dogs have consciousness, and I do believe that dogs do indeed have consciousness. Just the problem is that, well, how do we test consciousness? It's just such a hard thing to test. even this idea of recognizing self, we could have a whole relay of computers, for example, and program them all to do a certain function. And one of the computers, and they could all be programmed in such a way, like if we had 10 computers in a relay, for example, and they were all programmed to carry a certain function, unless they matched a certain IP address, which would be like the physical address of the computer. Well, and one of those computers matched that IP address. Well, that computer would not carry out that function, because it would say, I have that specific IP address, therefore I'm not going to carry the function. So that computer, in a sense, is determining that it's not going to do something specific because of what it is. It is that IP address. But it doesn't mean that computer is self-aware by any means. It's simply carrying an instruction. So these tests of consciousness are somewhat inherently flawed too, because there's not a direct measure of consciousness. I could talk forever and try to convince you that I have consciousness, but the direct evidence that I have consciousness will not always be absolute. So those are my thoughts. I'm Darryl Learie, and have a great day.